G'day guys, how's it going? Welcome to this episode of Pete vs. Plants. I am doing some chores today. And I should mention, I'm Pete, if you hadn't worked it out. These are the plants.
Thanks for clearing that up, Professor.
So I've got some chores to do. First things first, I got these obliquas recently. I think I did an unboxing, but I had a whole bunch of things arrive at the same time, and I kind of just didn't want to spam unboxing videos on the channels.
Flex. I am flexing.
So this video may come out prior to the unboxing, and if that's the case, forgive me. If the unboxing has come out first, I will put it up here. But yeah, what's there to talk about with the obliquas? I've had quite a few friends request these, and I know a guy who has been selling them at a really good price, at least here in Australia. These were each $200.
Flex.
So there'll probably be Americans and potentially people in Europe going like, did he say $200? That's actually a good price here. I've seen people trying to hawk these for $3,000 for something that big in Australia.
Oh, no.
But I know a guy, and he has a rather efficient way of propagating them. I think he ends up growing out multiple plants until they have runners and just lets the runner go for as long as possible. And then we'll chop that up and propagate them all as wet sticks. And yeah, anyway, so he sold a bunch of them to me. My biggest one, which I will get out after I have unwrapped these ones, was from an earlier batch that I think he did. It may have even come from the same batch as this one because it's about the same development with an extra leaf. And you can see that tiny little spike coming out, that's a new leaf. There may actually be a second leaf poking out at the same time too, right in there, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, so my one took off, it went bananas. I was really worried about it, thought it was sort of hit and miss at the start because the leaves were kind of browning up a little bit, sort of like these lower leaves here. So I was kind of like, oh God, what am I doing? Bleaching it, too much light, but by the looks of it, he was, you know, same sort of situation for him. So it's probably just that they were cuttings and the lower leaves do their job, get the energy, the carbohydrates going into the cutting, and then just decide to cark it and it'll make way for the larger leaves. Anyway, so long story short, I bought a bunch of them from him. These two have already been sold to my friends. I ended up just selling them at cost.
What a guy.
Because they were like, we want one. Yours looks amazing. And I was like, well, don't thank me for anything. I bought it and it pretty much just was like this. Thank the guy who sold them to me, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
He's the one who's done a good job taking cuttings and raising them. And so I was just like, look, just pay what I paid for them and I'll give you them.
All right, don't break an arm jerking yourself off.
And then I got one the other day on eBay. So ultimately I wanted to kind of have 2 to 3 of these in my stock to kind of kickstart the number of obliquas that I have and allow me to propagate them quickly. So I have another one on the way in the mail this week, which should arrive in a day or two. And that was from a different source, although from what I'm aware, every single obliqua you're likely to see online, in person, wherever it is, I think there are 2 different plants that the cuttings that you will see anywhere have ever come from. I was watching a video the other day, which, if I can remind myself, Future Pete, to link below. And it was from a young guy called Mick Mitty, I think, and he's over in the US. And he's really passionate about obliquas and learning more about their taxonomy. So, you know, how many species are there in there, where they're from, why they're so bloody weird and awesome. And why was I telling this story? Yeah, so he was doing the background of where the plant came from. How did people end up getting it? How did he get it? Where did the original plant get collected? How many specimens were collected? And from what he understands, or from what he's learnt, there were 2 separate times in the 1970s. I think he mentions it, and the video is really good, so go check it out. He mentions it specifically in there, but he says it was collected twice. That's the first one there. I think it was 1975 and then again in 1977. And so a botanical gardens that he mentions in the video in the US had it the entire time and ended up, I think, just taking cuttings and then giving them away or selling them. And he was telling this crazy story about how one of the original guys to get the cutting from the Botanic Gardens ended up selling them, like just making heaps and then selling them at an aeroid conference for like $8 a piece, like decades ago. And, you know, people were just not really that into them and so didn't go that crazy over them. And it was only in the last 5 or so years that obliqua, as we know it, one of these, became so popular among plant lovers. And the thing that I love and that really tickles my fancy, because I did a PhD in phylogenetics of Australian rats. So in layman's terms, effectively I was looking at all the different species of Australian rats and trying to work out their family tree. How are they related to one another? Is this a unique species? Is the one that lives in the desert, you know, is that the same species as the one that's sort of found in dry bushland, or are they different? You know, I was doing all that sort of taxonomic work. So I was based at a museum, but he was digging in and learning about all these different forms of obliqua. And this is, you know, the one that we typically know as Monstera obliqua Peruvian form. And he mentions that the holotype, so the original specimen that was given the species name Monstera obliqua, was actually found in Suriname in South America, and is the Suriname form. It's not this form. So if more work is ever done on this species, Monstera obliqua, and they find out that there are actually multiple species within what we currently call Monstera obliqua with all these different forms, right? So Peruvian form, the Amazonas form, the Suriname form, the Bolivian form. If these end up actually being individual species, what happens in taxonomic research is that the first specimen, the holotype, to be collected and given that species name, Monstera obliqua in this case, and the one from Suriname, I believe, again, check his video, that would be Monstera obliqua. That would get the species name, and everything else would have to be renamed. So this would actually not end up being, potentially, if it's found that this is a different species from the Suriname form will get its own, will stay Monstera obliqua, and every other obliqua, if it's another species from the Suriname form, will have either a different species name or many different species names. So watch this space. I think there's a young guy he was talking about from Colombia who's doing the work on Monstera and trying to sort of really untangle the complexity there and work out what is a species, what isn't a species, everything like that. And so this is why you see this stuff ever changing, guys. This is why taxonomy isn't just you find the plant, you work out what is it by looking at the leaves or the flowers and then being like, bam, that's the species name and it's always going to be that. You have these things change because especially in modern day, in the modern era, we have a lot of genetic sequencing, which is getting better exponentially. So we're finding out more and more that species we thought were previously, say, a single species are actually many different species. And a really cool story that I can tell you guys about this, I did my work with one of my friends called Emily Roycroft. And she recently discovered that 2 species of Australian mouse that I was studying, and obviously she was as well, ended up being the same species. And so what happened was that when colonists first got to Australia, they brought with them, you know, in the decades following, sheep and cattle and, you know, goats and horses and everything else that trampled the land. And effectively in Australia, we don't have ungulates native to the continent, right? So we don't have mammals that have hard hooves like cows, sheep, goats, horses natively here. So the animals and the plants and the organisms that are natively found here have adapted to live in an environment where the soil isn't compacted the same way that it is in places like Europe or South America or whatever, right? So animals like all the marsupials we have, they have soft feet and they walk across the ground and they don't compact it. And the plants that have evolved here they can only really handle soil that hasn't been densely compacted. That's how they, you know, have evolved. And the animals that eat those plants have evolved obviously to eat the plants. And if those plants disappear because sheep walk over the soil and the plants can't grow, then you end up with, you know, extinctions occurring. So what happened was that shortly after Europeans arrived in Australia, after, what was that, 1778, when the first fleet got here, 1778? 1788, Jesus, I should know better. They brought with them these livestock. The livestock was sort of just let go and, you know, just sort of roamed around. And pretty quickly, within the next 100 years or so, loads and loads of mammal species went extinct. And Australia has the shittest record for mammal extinctions because of this. And my study group, the Taxonomy species group, is probably the most affected group out of all the mammals in Australia that suffered extinction. So I think, it was something like 10 different species went extinct within 150 years of Europeans arriving in Australia, just within my little group of rats that I was studying. And so this included half of the hopping mice, which are really cute. I'll put some photos up of them. They evolved to live in the desert and have the most efficient kidneys of any mammal, so they can effectively survive without drinking. They're that adapted to the desert. But what happened was we had this Taxonomy Chat, which was this mouse that was found in the east of Australia. And I think it was collected, obviously, by Gould, who was this naturalist that went through Australia collecting a whole bunch of different animals and plants, and I think he was most famous for his birds. But he found this animal, named it Taxonomy Chat, and then later on, we found the shark bay mouse, and that was named Taxonomy Fieldii, and that was found all throughout Australia up to sort of that east coast there. And what happened was that its range contracted all the way back to Shark Bay, and it's only now found on a small island off of the coast of Australia because its habitat was obviously just decimated by these invasive species. But the work that Emily ended up doing found that the genomes of these two species, these two separate species, were actually the same species. And the range of both of them was originally obviously a single range where they all existed, but they were pushed into pockets, and then eventually Fieldii was completely wiped out on the mainland and only lived in a little pocket on an island off the coast of Western Australia, and Gouldii disappeared completely. So long story short, that was one of these cool things that using ancient DNA techniques, museum specimens, there were some specimens of Gouldii collected, but they were in a museum. And, they got to take DNA out of the bones. This was some of the research I was doing, pulling DNA out of these collections that were, hundreds of years old. And she ran the genetics on them and found out, lo and behold, these two species are actually just one species. So that's really cool. And it was funny too, because I think in the books you would read that they had different descriptions. This one had dark fur, this one had light fur, this one had a, slightly silver ears or whatever it is. And it turns out, well, no, actually they're just the same species. So long story short, that's the kind of thing that may happen, and it's probable that it'll happen with Monstera obliqua. When people actually go in and start doing the DNA work, and all they really need is a single leaf from each different form, and they can run the genetics on them, compare them. Effectively, you take a number of genes, thousands of genes probably now, using next generation sequencing, align them and just look for how many differences there are, and based on the number of differences between those genes, you'll be able to work out whether or not they're in a single species or if there are many different species, right? So it's kind of a complicated area to talk about, to explain how they do it, but that's effectively the sort of the long and the short of it. They get the genetics, they line it up, they look at, are there differences, how many differences, are they the same, are they different, and then they can work out, okay, so based on our criteria, these things are not the same species, these things are the same species. So it's probable that these different forms of Monstera obliqua will end up different species. So yeah, anyway, rant over. Hopefully you found that interesting, guys. I miss it, and I loved studying, I loved studying so much about how species evolve and about what we call a species. How do you determine what a genus is, what a species is, where does one start and stop, especially when you run into issues like, what if species can hybridize? What if they naturally do that in the wild too? Where do you then draw the line if they are actually able to mate and interbreed and have offspring and everything like that, but there's still significant morphological differences between these different plants or animals or whatever the organism is? So that was task one. These two are absolutely beautiful plants, guys. I am also on the Monstera obliqua boat, at least the Peruvian form, right, for now, and just thinking how awesome they are. They're just incredible. But yeah, I've got to go get mine, and I'll show you mine too. Now, the interesting thing is, I'm not sure. These could be from the same batch, I potentially would expect these to have all been from the same runner that he took and that he chopped up. Each one is about the same in terms of development, like in terms of number of leaves, right? There's a fourth leaf coming out here. This one has 4 leaves. But the interesting thing is, I don't know the conditions under which Dan was growing these, but he's up in Queensland, so I expect it to be a lot more humid and warm. And mine just seems to have gone off. So I'm not sure why that is. Dan, if you're watching this, you'll have to let me know what you suspect the reason is. But mine rapidly got these extra and extra large leaves. So the only difference, again, under the assumption that these are all at the same, level of progression in terms of how long the cuttings have been taken and how long they were rooting for and everything like that, the only thing I can imagine is that I'm potentially giving this one more light. That's the only thing I can hypothesize. I don't have a great deal of humidity here. It's like sits at about 60% where this guy's sitting. But yeah, these leaves sized up really quickly. And I just absolutely love Monsteras, and especially these Monsteras with huge fenestrations. That's my jam. That's also why I like Monstera Esqueleto, and can't wait to size up my collection of them. Anyway, this has almost been a video in and of itself, guys, so I'm not really sure. I'll have a look and see if I've got some more chores, but maybe we just make this a Monstera obliqua rant video. Anyway, I'm gonna go put these back on the shelves, and if I don't return, then the video's done. Yeah, actually, I think I'm gonna have to bugger off and grab my kids from the daycare center. So thank you so much for joining me, guys. YouTube reckons you're gonna enjoy this video. It's always a pleasure. Tooroo.